Hi, everybody. Welcome to this Fireside chat. My name is María Cruz. I'm a program manager at the Google Open Source Program Office. And I have here with me Caroline Sinders, a machine learning researcher and artist. Caroline and I met while working at the Wikimedia Foundation, and she's here today to talk about remote workplace toxicity and online harassment. Caroline, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm Caroline Sinders. I run Convocation Design and Research, a consulting firm where we use design and R&D to analyze complex problems on different kinds of platforms and looking at how technology affects society. So recently I've been working on a report with McKensie Mack Group and Project Include with Ellen Powell on remote workplace toxicity and harassment with a specific focus on COVID-19 since the COVID-19 stay-at-home orders across the globe have forced workplaces to go from being in person to being totally remote. And within this, we saw a lot of problems start to arise, and we wanted to create a report to try to address different issues we were seeing.
Great. Thank you for being here. Um, I I was reflecting on the fact that looking at your work, how you look into words that are used in online conversations from a quantitative perspective. I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit more on the choice of words that we use when talking to each other online. Um, what is the weight that words have in conversation? Why is it so taxing for us when somebody says something mean to us?
For sure. Thank you for that. I tend to look at actions, words, events, and the design affordances of systems around us. So how a person builds a mental model of the technology around them that they exist in. Generally, I look at people inside of networks and platforms. So when I'm studying a problem, I'm looking at how someone may be facing harassment inside of something like Facebook, or how someone can face harm using GitHub, right? So just what the design of that platform is, and then what are the tools someone has at hand to mitigate that harm. And then I'm looking at the different kinds and levels of harm within that. So the words people use, and sometimes the words people don't use. So it's a very multi-pronged problem. One thing that's important to keep in mind, and I'm sure I don't have to spend a lot of time arguing this, I'm sure this audience would agree with me that our online lives are as real as our offline lives. So something that someone says to you online is as hurtful as something someone says to you offline. Like if you were to tell me over video chat that you didn't like my lipstick color, like that wouldn't feel good because I thought we were friends, right? But also that would be a very rude thing to say to the invited speaker. And so while that could be an innocuous statement, how you would articulate that to me, it would still be somewhat hurtful, right? And so what I think is important is to look at the different kinds of words and languages people use in response to harassment. So we can have more direct forms of harassment, like a direct threat, curse words, words that are generally agreed to be harmful, right? And so that can be describing different kinds of abuse or like leveling abuse at someone. Again, things like curse words or talking about physical harm. But there are also forms of language and actions that may seem more innocuous that are in fact quite toxic. So this is where we are looking at things like microaggressions. So someone saying to you, "You speak so well," and saying that in a surprised way, or just generally saying that is a form of a microaggression that is toxic. It just may not initially read to someone as toxic. So it's not necessarily innocuous, right? So that phrase, "You speak so well," like you pause, speak so well, all those as different words may not seem toxic or as toxic as a swear word, but when strung together, it has a sort of cultural and biased weight behind it that is then harmful to the recipient. So I look at things like this, like what are the norms of a group inside of a space, and then what are varying levels of veiled harm that are then leveled at people, and how do we sort of elevate that and talk about that. I'm extremely interested in toxicity and what I think what like more privileged groups could think of as like innocuous harm that is probably as best described as like microaggressions.
I think you're touching on a very interesting topic here, which is what are the different ways in which we can enter conflict in a conversation. I remember a presentation you gave at Wikimania 2017 where you started the conversation by stating that an important distinction that between conflict, harassment, and abuse. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that difference.
For sure. So I think there are varying levels of interactions and frictions people can encounter. So conflict is really natural. One thing I like to say is community doesn't mean friendship. Just because we're in a community together, that doesn't mean that I need to like you or vice versa. But that doesn't give you carte blanche to be mean to me or be mean to someone else. So communities will naturally have friction within them. People will not get along. And that's actually pretty natural. It's how you manifest that friction and how you respond to someone. That's actually where harassment and abuse can lie. So one thing that's important to think about, I think, is intent versus impact. So someone may say something and not understand the impact of their words. Perhaps there's a cultural difference. Perhaps there's a generational difference. Perhaps they just said something off the cuff and didn't really think about it. And their intent is not to harm, but the impact of their actions actually causes harm. And I think it's important to look at the impact really rather versus the intent. This is where I really advise communities to create a ladder of consequences. So being able to say this kind of action is going to have this kind of response from us as the organizers. And this is how it matches up to our terms of service, community guidelines, code of conduct, employee handbook, etc. So if someone does accidentally say something and it's considered a lower form of harassment or abuse, we can handle it more as just general conflict, where an intermediary can step in, explain why that was harmful, give an action. So that could be a punitive response, that could be education, that could, say like you have to issue an apology, and then sort of like move on, right? And so when you have this ladder of consequences, you can start to look at actions and say like, well, actually, what is the severity of them and where do they fall within this? And map out responses. You can have a sort of a structured response, and it can be agreed upon response. So, if someone engages in, let's say, physical violence, the ladder of consequences may say, actually, all physical violence results in an immediate dismissal from our community. And we've all agreed upon that because it's in our code of conduct. And we've mapped it in our ladder of consequences, maybe on the top step, which is where immediate dismissal is. So it's really important to be able to understand that not all actions are necessarily abusive. So lower forms of abuse, which we could put into the conflict area, if they continue, especially after someone has said, I'm uncomfortable, please don't do that, those lower forms stack up and can create a very toxic and then very harmful and then very abusive environment. So also like the repeated engagement of bad actions, can all needs to be mapped out and analyzed as well. And in my presentation at Wikimania in 2017, that was something I was really interested in, is how do we look at repeating lower forms of toxicity, especially within the Wikimedia universe. So, if someone is constantly correcting you or undoing your edits, that at first can look like conflict, but if it continues and continues and continues and you've asked this person to stop, your edits have no reason to be undone or re-edited in any way, that is a form of harassment because you've asked someone to stop and they are not listening to you setting a boundary and they're actually invading your boundary.
I see clearly the role of people and moderators in these processes that you describe. I was wondering what role can technology and specifically machine learning play in holding or supporting a code of conduct for a project, for an open source project, for example, or for any online community? How far can we go with using this technology to support these processes?
I don't really know how, like, what the role should be of technology within this, or rather, I do know, and my advice is often like not a big role, because I think to solve human problems, you need human responses. So in the case of moderation, you can use machine learning to try to build a classifier on abusive language, and what you're really building is a keyword filter, I think, at that point, because a lot of harassment and toxicity are the things that we say in context. So someone telling me, or someone even saying to you, you speak so well, like that can be extremely harmful, right? But to any kind of tone analyzer or sentiment analysis, that seems almost like a positive statement, right? So I think what's important to recognize is that harassment at times is not very blatant. It's very, very contextual, and or it's tailored specifically to the victim. So machine learning can't help in, I think, analyzing that. What does help, I think, is training with diversity and inclusion experts and racial justice experts to recognize those kinds of interactions when they pop up, for communities to build a plan and a ladder of consequences and implement that plan and that ladder of consequences when harm arises, and to do it quickly and to feel sort of confident in their response. Meaning, I notice this a lot in a lot of different communities I've been in, and particularly also in the Wikimedia community, where people would lean back a little bit and say, well, how do we know that that person, like, maybe they didn't mean it? And I always like to say, like, it doesn't really, like, the intent and impact are very different things. The intent of someone doesn't lessen the impact of their actions or the harm of their actions. I may not intend to hurt you, but I have hurt you. And so I think it's important to separate intent and impact when we're looking at responding to varying levels of toxicity and harm.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely. I think some of the most common misunderstandings or disconnect between people happen when there is that gap between, oh, I actually tried to say X, and the impact that had was completely different. So I think acknowledging that's a difference, and is probably one of the first steps away from abuse or harassment. Let's go back a little bit to the research project that you're working on right now. You were talking about different information inputs that you were analyzing from different companies that were providing data, and then there's also a survey. Is that right?
Yeah, so we're not actually taking data from companies. We're looking at like pre-existing literature that companies have published, like their own findings in response to remote work during the pandemic.
What are the next steps when you analyze all of these data? How do you hope to apply this for, is it going to be available for other companies to learn from? Is it going to be accompanied by a guide, or how do you see this project going forward?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's going to be a research report with specific recommendations for what companies can do right now in this moment. We're confident and hopeful that the recommendations will work for varying size companies, from companies potentially as large as Google to companies as small as a consulting firm of one or two people. Right. So our goal is to really create widespread impact, and also think about scale when suggesting different kinds of solutions. And we are thinking about how scale affects implementation. Primarily for us, we are trying to be really actionable also in these recommendations, so they won't be necessarily pie in the sky recommendations, but like things we have learned from conducting our research. I can share a few with you, like what we've started to notice already, though we're still in the process of we're finishing up research and we're going to start writing soon. So one thing we've learned is that companies really need plans and structure. And I know I've said this earlier, but it's something where they need to have an answer for every kind of scenario that can pop up. So one thing we've seen is companies offer free time or time off available to employees that is time off that you don't have to take vacation for, just like blanket time off during the pandemic. And what we've like learned from different people we've interviewed is that particularly like when their companies offered this, the company didn't actually make a plan of how someone could access that time off. And then it turned out that time off was actually only available to some employees with children. So one person or a few people we've interviewed had really highlighted like wanting to access this benefit, and their managers actually didn't know how they could access that benefit. So the managers had to go up the chain and then figure out actually what that would look like. So the company made time off available, but they didn't also make a plan for who would fill in the gaps of that time off. So who picks up the slack when part of like if a third of the company decides to go 50% time. So offering that kind of support is one thing, but you need to have a plan to really implement that support so the company doesn't fall into chaos. And in this case, there wasn't really a plan. Part of the implication was perhaps that the employees that were not taking time off would try to pick up some of the slack, but that doesn't alleviate the employees who are working full-time. That doesn't alleviate their stress or even the general anxiety they could feel in response to, COVID-19 and working from home and the general stress of the pandemic, which is stressful. So one thing we also noticed is people generally feel much more anxiety now than they have before the pandemic. And while that may seem like an obvious takeaway, what that means is if your company is letting some employees take off and others not to, already emotionally taxed employees are now more taxed. They're overtaxed. So that was a big thing. Another thing was we noticed some companies in response to working remotely created no work plan. So some people we interviewed remarked how their day-to-day accountability was actually just like water cooler chats with their manager. So how do we translate a water cooler chat, in a remote workplace? That can be someone just randomly slacking you or sending you like a G chat. But while that sounds also innocuous, imagine if you're like knee deep in a problem, trying to problem solve something, and your manager just pings you out of nowhere. Trying to switch gears to respond to that can be stressful, especially if you don't know when you're going to get pinged. That also means that at any point in any time, if you got up to go to the bathroom, nobody knows that. And so someone pings you and you come back 20 minutes later, they may be like, where were you? And if you're in a very stressful workplace, they may not trust that you were working and didn't see it. They may make all kinds of assumptions about your work, right? So this is also what I mean is that this lack of structure places a lot of stress on employees because it can be harder for them to show the work that they did during a day because there's no way to there's no outline of what they're supposed to do, right? Or also it just means that they're working in these incredibly stressful short sprints. If every day the plan is just tell your boss what you're working on, that is not a good project management plan. So this also increases anxiety. Also, people are getting slacked, not during work hours and then feeling a general anxiety that they should be available to any message when in fact you are allowed to, not respond to work if it's like 8 p.m. your time and that's not the time you work. So different things like that. Another thing also is some companies we've noticed because their way to try to make accountability is to just fill the day with different Zoom calls and different kinds of video calls and check-ins, which also doesn't make an easier work day because if you spend 6 hours in video calls, when are you supposed to actually do your work? So it's different things like that are actually extremely problematic and that are really disruptive for people's work styles and are increasing the level of stress that they're feeling.
Yeah. And it sounds like some of the key takeaways, as you were mentioning, is designing more structure for employees, but also designing with a user in mind. So if there are benefits around taking time off, designing that for the people that need it, that may or may not have kids or may or may not have sick relatives or people they have to take care of. This is really fascinating. I hope that that's I'm looking forward to reading the report and seeing where this goes. We covered all the topics that we had in our agenda. Is there anything else that I'm missing, or anything else that you would like to um, that you would like to speak about?
Sure. I mean, I think one thing I want to really emphasize for people listening to this is, um, right now is a really stressful and taxing time for anybody, regardless of the location they're in and just regardless of who they are. But it is especially stressful for marginalized groups and people of color right now. And that when we're designing things that can feel as, again, mundane as a work structure, those are not mundane structures that will dictate how someone spends, 7 or 8 or 9 of their like waking hours, maybe even more, like 10 or 12, depending upon where someone works. And so one thing I often reflect on is, when I've been working remotely since 2016. And at one place I worked at, so much of my day was just being on video calls that I didn't have enough time in my day to actually do my job, which was doing design research. And my manager didn't really understand that. Like, he didn't understand if I had a meeting and then an hour of free time and then 2 meetings and then an hour of free time, like why I couldn't get my work done. And it was because he was not a researcher, he was a product manager. And trying to explain to him how difficult it is to switch gears from writing to not writing to then answering emails, like that just wasn't possible, proved to be a really hard conversation with him. And so one thing I want people to think about is like, are they giving their employees time to build a work schedule that makes sense for them? So for me, what would have been helpful is like one day of work calls, right? And then if, like, let's say in a week, if I needed to have, I don't know, 15 work calls, like, can I spread that out across 2 days? Like, can I put that in to 2 days of, and that's it? And then like the rest of the week, can I have time for writing, maybe one-on-one feedback from like what I'm writing, etc. Like, that would have been a way for me to have been successful in my job. And like, my manager made it seem like it was possible for our work to be that flexible when it really wasn't. Like, no one would like respect my time if I said like I'm actually full of meetings, right? And meetings being like I'm writing. So that's what I mean. Like, I want people to really reflect on that and interact with their employees and ask, like, what do you need to be most successful? And then to listen to their employees and give them that space and those boundaries so they can actually succeed during a time where it's really hard. One of our interviewees pointed out something, that even though they're single and they don't have dependents, it's really a stressful time for them because they're totally alone. And that even doing basic things like going to the doctor can take 3 times as long, right? Or going and getting groceries. And so these regular mundane things we do are also much, much harder to do. And their schedule wasn't allowing for that. And like, their manager didn't seem to understand that either, where it was like, oh, but you don't have a dependent, so why is it hard for you? And it's like, well, it is stressful going to the grocery store if it takes me like 4 hours to do that, or it is stressful if I get a call from the doctor and they suddenly have something open, otherwise it's a 3-month wait. Like, that doesn't, that is stress inducing. And so this is what I mean, where I think companies can't just say that they're listening or that they want to help, they actually have to put that help into practice and design a system that responds to it. Another person mentioned how their workplace was going to have like a day with no meetings, but didn't actually think about, well, how do you redesign our work so we need less meetings? So it's like, okay, if you give us a day with no meetings, do all the meetings have to go somewhere else then, unless we figure out a way to really eliminate meetings, like, or eliminate some unnecessary meetings. And this is what I mean with a structure. Saying you can have time off or saying we're going to have less meetings, you have to translate that into a structure and a plan that makes space and time for that. That may mean bringing on, for this one company that's like, you can all work part-time, that may mean bringing on more part-time employees so the work can still get done. If another company is saying we want to have less meetings, that means sitting down and saying, like, how can we translate some of these meetings into digital asynchronous stand-ups that happen across like messaging platforms, right? How can we better translate meetings into emails?
Thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you for joining this fireside chat and for sharing what you have learned and what you're learning in the process as well. And we look forward to reading the outcomes of the research.
Yeah, thank you. I'll definitely share them when we're done.